I took the job at Hargrove State College because it was the only facilities position within 60 miles that offered benefits. That's not a dramatic reason. It's not even an interesting one. But I think it matters because it explains why I stayed as long as I did, even after I started noticing things. When you're 41 and your knees already sound like bubble wrap, and the last place you worked shut down its physical plant and outsourced everything to a contractor who paid $9 less an hour, you don't quit a state job because the emergency lights in one building flicker on by themselves once a year. You log it. You file the work order. You try to find the short. And when you can't find the short, you reset the panel and move on. That's what I told myself, anyway. Hargrove is a small campus. 5 main buildings arranged in a rough U shape around a central lawn that goes brown every August and stays that way until April. Building A is administration. Building B is the library and student services. Building D is the science wing. Building E is the gym and the auditorium and 2 classrooms that smell permanently of chlorine because they share ductwork with the pool. Building C is the humanities building. 3 floors. Built in 1971. Brick exterior, poured concrete stairwells, drop ceilings with acoustic tile, fluorescent T8 fixtures in every room and hallway. The kind of building that looks exactly like every other institutional building constructed in that decade. Long corridors, heavy fire doors, classroom numbers stenciled on frosted glass panels. There's nothing remarkable about it. I want to be clear about that. It's not an old asylum. It's not built on a burial ground. It's an ugly, ordinary, state-funded academic building that smells like floor wax and old paper. I started in October. My supervisor was a man named Dale Pressick, who'd been head of facilities at Hargrove for 22 years. Dale was the kind of guy who communicated almost entirely through Post-it notes and grunts. He gave me a ring of keys, a laminated map of the campus with the utility tunnels marked in red, and a 3-ring binder full of maintenance schedules. He told me my primary responsibility would be building C and D with shared coverage on B. "You'll want to get to know C," he said. That was the most he said to me my first week. The binder was thorough. Every system in every building had its own tab: HVAC, plumbing, electrical, fire suppression, elevators, roofing, pest control. I spent my first few days just reading through it, getting familiar with the equipment. Building C's electrical system was old, but not ancient. The original panel had been replaced in 1998. The emergency lighting ran on its own circuit, tied to a battery backup system in the mechanical room on the ground floor. Standard setup. When power was lost, the emergency lights, those rectangular white units you see bolted above doorways in every school and hospital, would kick on automatically to illuminate the exit paths. Simple system. Nothing sophisticated about it. In Dale's binder, under the electrical tab for Building C, there was a section labeled Recurring. Most buildings had one. A leaky valve that needed repacking every spring, a roof drain that clogged with leaves every November. Normal stuff. Building C's recurring entry was a single line, typed, not handwritten. Emergency lighting. Full activation. March. Check battery packs. Reset transfer switch. No cause found. Below that, in pencil, someone had added, C-log. I didn't know what log that referred to. I assumed it meant the general maintenance log, which was a shared spreadsheet on the facility's office computer, a beige Dell that ran Windows 7 and took 4 minutes to boot. I searched it for Building C emergency lighting entries. There were dozens, all in March, going back to 2005, which is when they'd started using the digital log. Every single entry said essentially the same thing. Emergency lighting in Building C activated without power loss. All floors. All units. Inspected circuit. No fault found. Reset system. The dates varied slightly. Sometimes it was March 3rd. Sometimes March 8th. Once it was March 14th. But always March. Always the full building. Every emergency light on every floor. All at once. And every time, no electrical fault, no power interruption, no explanation. I remember looking at that list and feeling mildly curious. The way you feel when you find a strange pattern in mundane data. Not scared, not even particularly interested. Just, that's odd. Must be a degraded relay or a bad sensor in the transfer switch. Probably temperature related. Something expanding or contracting as the season changed. March in that part of the state is when the freeze-thaw cycle really gets going. Could easily cause a micro-interruption in the panel that the building management system wasn't sensitive enough to detect. I made a note to inspect the transfer switch before March. Then I forgot about it for months. Winter at Hargrove was quiet. The student population was small, maybe 2,000, and half of them seemed to vanish between Thanksgiving and late January. I spent most of my time on boiler maintenance and ice management. Dale and I developed a routine. He handled buildings A and E, I handled C and D, and we split B. We rarely spoke beyond the logistical. He was not unfriendly, exactly, just closed. Like a filing cabinet that had been locked so long nobody remembered where the key was. Building C in winter was cold and still. The heating system worked, but the building had no insulation to speak of. The hallways on the third floor were always 10 degrees cooler than the rest. I'd walk them during my evening rounds, checking door locks, making sure no faucets were dripping, looking for anything that needed attention, and the silence had a specific quality to it. Not eerie, just dense. The sound of my boots on the tile would echo in a way that made me aware of how empty the hallways were, how many closed doors lined both sides, how many dark classrooms sat behind frosted glass with the chairs stacked on the desks. I started to notice small things during those rounds, the kind of details you only pick up when you walk the same corridors night after night. A water stain on the ceiling tile outside room 307 that seemed to grow and shrink with the humidity. The way the fire door on the second floor stairwell didn't quite sit flush in its frame, so it made a faint whistling sound when the air pressure shifted. The smell on the ground floor near the mechanical room, something metallic and flat, like old pennies, that I could never trace to a source. None of these things were unusual for a building that old. I cataloged them mentally the way I cataloged everything. Drip, draft, smell. Fix what you can. Monitor what you can't. February came and went. I'd completely forgotten about the emergency lighting. On March 6th, I was in the facilities office finishing a purchase order for replacement ballasts when my phone buzzed. It was the campus security desk. The night guard, a kid named Marcus, who was probably 23 but looked 17, told me the emergency lights in Building C had come on. All of them? I asked. Yeah, the whole building. I can see it from the parking lot. Every window on every floor. I told him I'd go check it out. It was about 9:40 in the evening. The campus was dark and cold, mid-30s, no wind. I walked across the quad toward Building C, and I could see what Marcus meant. The building was dark. The regular lights were off, as they should have been, but through every window, I could see the pale, clinical glow of the emergency units. That flat, white LED light that doesn't really illuminate so much as it makes darkness visible. I let myself in through the south entrance. The hallway stretched out in front of me, lit only by those rectangular emergency units above each doorway. The regular overhead fluorescents were off. The exit signs were glowing green. It looked exactly like a power outage, except the power wasn't out. I checked the nearest wall switch and flipped it. The regular fluorescents buzzed on immediately. Power was fine. I went down to the mechanical room and opened the emergency lighting panel. Everything looked normal. The transfer switch was in its resting position. The battery packs were reading full charge. There was no fault indicator, no alarm, nothing on the panel that suggested any reason the lights should have activated. I reset the system. The emergency lights went off. I walked back through the building, turning off the regular lights I'd flipped on during my inspection. The whole thing took maybe 20 minutes. I logged it. 3/6. Emergency lighting, Building C, full activation, all floors. No power loss detected. No fault found. System reset. I added my entry to the same list I'd found months earlier. The same list that went back 20 years. That night, sitting in my truck in the parking lot before driving home, I pulled up the log on my phone and scrolled through the old entries again. 20 years. Every March. No explanation ever found. Different technicians. I could see at least 4 different sets of initials on the older entries. Dale's. Someone before Dale. Someone before that. All of them had looked at the same panel. All of them had found nothing wrong. I sat there for a while. The building was dark again. Just the exit signs glowing faintly green through the glass. I drove home. The next day, I asked Dale about it. We were in the facility's workshop, a cinder block room in the basement of Building A that smelled like WD-40 and coffee. The emergency lights in C went on last night, I said. Dale nodded. He was sorting through a bin of conduit fittings. Happens every March, he said. Yeah, I saw the log. Has anyone ever figured out why? Nope. Have you had an electrician look at it? Twice. First time was probably 2010, 2011. We brought in Harman Electric. They went through the whole system, tested every circuit, every sensor, every battery pack, found nothing. They suggested we replace the transfer switch, so we did. Happened again the next March. He picked up a coupling, examined it, put it back. Second time was maybe 2015. Different company, same result. Nothing wrong with the system, and it only happens in March. Only March. Every March, far as I know. Before my time, even. Jenkins, the guy I replaced, he told me about it when I started. Said it had been happening since at least the 90s. I waited for him to say more. He didn't. He moved on to sorting a different bin. Does it bother you? I asked. Dale looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not annoyance. Something more like patience, the kind you develop when you've had the same conversation enough times. It's a building, he said. Buildings do weird things. I've got a thermostat in D that reads 8 degrees high every Tuesday for no reason. I've got a sump pump and a that cycles on dry days. Old systems have quirks. You fix what you can. The rest you just live with. He was right, of course. That's what experience teaches you. Not everything has a tidy explanation. Some things are just artifacts of aging infrastructure, accumulated wiring errors, and decades of patch jobs by different hands. I'd seen similar things at other jobs. A motion sensor that triggered itself at the same time every afternoon because of the angle of the sun, a fire alarm panel that threw a trouble signal every time someone microwaved popcorn in a room 2 floors away because of a ventilation cross-connection nobody had documented. But those things had causes, even if it took time to find them. The Building C emergency lights had been investigated repeatedly by qualified people over the span of 20 years, and nobody had found a cause. That distinction stayed with me, quietly, like a popcorn hull stuck between my teeth. I started spending more time in Building C, not because I was obsessed. Not then, but because once something enters your awareness as a problem, you see the building differently. I started paying closer attention to the electrical systems. I traced wiring. I checked junction boxes. I examined the emergency lighting units themselves, climbing a stepladder to look at each one, checking the connections, the test buttons, the battery cells. Everything was normal. Everything was maintained, up to code, functional. I requested the building's original electrical blueprints from the county records office. They arrived 3 weeks later in a cardboard tube, large format sheets, hand-drafted, dated 1970. I spread them out on the workshop table and compared them to the as-built drawings we had on file. They mostly matched, which was unusual in itself. Old buildings almost never match their original prints because of decades of modifications. But Building C's electrical system had been updated so rarely that the original layout was still largely intact, except for the 1998 panel replacement and a few added circuits for computer labs. I couldn't find anything in the plans that suggested a design flaw. One afternoon in late March, the lights had already done their thing for the year, so I wasn't expecting anything. I was replacing a ballast in a second-floor classroom, and I found something behind the fixture. Not inside the fixture itself, but in the space above the drop ceiling, resting on the back of the next tile over. a clipboard. It was dusty. The metal clip was rusted, and the paper, a single sheet, was yellowed and stiff. It was a maintenance inspection form, the old kind, pre-digital, printed on goldenrod paper with carbon copy backing. The date at the top was March 9, 1997. The form was for Building C, ground floor through third floor, emergency lighting inspection. Most of the checkboxes were filled in. Normal, normal, normal. But at the bottom in the comments section, someone had written in small, careful handwriting. All units activated again 3/9. Full building. No power event. Third time I've documented this. Nobody wants to hear about it. Requested transfer to building a... The initials were GM. I stared at that form for a long time. There was something about finding a physical object. Something handwritten by someone who had stood in this same building almost 30 years ago and experienced the same thing. That made the pattern feel suddenly more real than the spreadsheet entries ever had. GM had stood in these hallways, had seen these lights come on for no reason, had tried to tell someone, had asked to be moved. I brought the clipboard down to Dale. He looked at it, read the comment, and set it on his desk. Probably Gary Metzger, he said. Before Jenkins. Before my time. He requested a transfer. Dale looked at me again with that same patient expression. People don't like unexplained things. Doesn't mean there isn't an explanation. Just means we haven't found it yet. In 30 years. Dale didn't answer that. April and May were busy. The spring semester meant more foot traffic, more wear on the buildings, more work orders. I didn't think much about the emergency lighting. But something had shifted in how I experienced Building C. Not dramatically. Not like I was afraid to go inside. More like I was listening differently, paying attention to things I normally would have filtered out. The metallic smell near the mechanical room. I'd noticed it before, but now I started tracking it. Some days it was there, some days it wasn't. It didn't correlate with anything I could identify. Not the HVAC cycle, not the weather, not the time of day. It was faint, almost subliminal, the kind of smell you can't be sure you're actually detecting until you stop and deliberately inhale. The third floor hallway temperature. I'd noted it ran cold, but I started carrying a pocket thermometer and checking it at different times. The readings were inconsistent. Not wildly, within a 5-degree range. But they didn't track with the thermostat settings or the outside temperature the way they should have. The third floor would sometimes be warmer at night than during the day, which made no sense given the solar load on the roof, the stairwell fire door that whistled. I adjusted the hinges, added weather stripping, checked the closer. The whistling stopped for 2 days, then came back. I adjusted it again. Same result. The gap wasn't consistent. Sometimes the door sat flush. Sometimes it didn't. I found myself making notes. Not in the official log. These observations were too vague, too subjective to write up as maintenance issues. I kept them in a small notebook I carried in my back pocket. Smell. Yes/no. Third floor temp. Stairwell door gap. Times and dates. I didn't know what I was looking for. I told myself I was just being thorough. Summer was quiet. The building was mostly empty. I did a full ceiling tile inspection on the third floor as part of routine maintenance, and I found 3 more items above the drop ceiling that shouldn't have been there. Not clipboards this time. A pencil. A woman's wristwatch with a dead battery. The crystal cracked. And a laminated card. The kind you'd clip to a lanyard. With the Hargrove State College logo. And a name. Dr. Priyachandran, English department. I looked up the name in the college directory. No results. I tried the library's archived course catalogs, the ones that went back to the 70s. I found her. Dr. Priyachandran had been an associate professor of English at Hargrove from 1988 to 2003. Her photo showed a woman in her 40s, dark hair pulled back, small glasses, an expression that was hard to read, not quite smiling, not quite not. She'd left in 2003. There was no indication of why. No retirement announcement in the campus newsletter archives, no emerita listing. She simply wasn't in the 2003-2004 catalog. Her courses had been reassigned to adjuncts. I found her office had been room 312, third floor. The same hallway that ran cold. I'm aware of how this sounds. I'm arranging details into a pattern that may not exist. A professor's lost ID badge above a ceiling tile could mean anything. It could have been knocked up there during a renovation, dropped through a gap, placed there by a student as a prank. The cold hallway is probably just poor insulation on the north-facing wall. The metallic smell is probably corroding galvanized pipe somewhere behind the drywall. I know that. But I also know that once you start seeing a pattern, you can't unsee it. And the pattern I was seeing, or imagining, centered on the third floor of Building C in the month of March. I tried to find Gary Metzger, the facilities technician whose initials were on the 1997 inspection form. Dale said he'd retired in the late 90s and might have moved out of state. The college HR office told me they couldn't release personnel information for former employees. I tried a few online searches, but the name was common and I didn't have much to go on. I did find one thing. In the campus newspaper archive, actual newspapers, bound in volumes in the library basement, there was a small article from March 1995. It was about a power outage that had affected several buildings on campus during a late winter storm. Building C was mentioned. But the article also noted, in a single sentence near the end, that emergency lighting in Building C, which had activated prior to the general power failure, remained operational throughout the outage. Prior to. The emergency lights had come on before the power went out. I read that sentence several times. It could have been a reporting error. Student journalists aren't always precise about timeline details. But if it was accurate, it meant the lights had activated independently, on their own, and then the power outage had happened afterward. Which meant the emergency lighting wasn't responding to a power loss. It was doing something else. I put the newspaper volume back on the shelf and sat in the library basement for a while, in one of those hard wooden chairs that every college library has, under fluorescent lights that buzzed at a slightly different frequency than the ones in Building C. I was thinking about the word prior. That fall, I did something I probably shouldn't have. I started going to Building C at night. Not for rounds. My evening rounds only required one pass through each building, and I usually did C between 7 and 8. I'm talking about later. 10, 11 o'clock. Sometimes midnight. I'd sit in the third floor hallway in one of the plastic chairs outside room 312 and just listen. I don't know what I expected to hear. The building made the sounds that all buildings make at night. The ticking of pipes cooling, the distant hum of the boiler, the occasional click of a relay somewhere in the walls, air moving through ducts. The buildings settling, if buildings actually settle, which I've never been fully convinced they do. But there was something about the third floor at night that I couldn't quantify. A quality to the silence that felt specific. Not empty silence. Occupied silence. The kind of silence that happens when someone in the next room stops talking because they heard you coming. I know that's not a technical observation. I know it doesn't belong in a maintenance log, but I'm trying to be honest about what I experienced, and what I experienced was a feeling of proximity, of being near something I couldn't see or measure. Some nights I'd bring my notebook and sit there and write down everything I perceived. Temperature. Cold, colder than the second floor by 6 degrees. Smell. Faint. Metallic. Intermittent. Sound. Nothing unusual. Feeling. Watched. I wrote, watched, and then crossed it out and wrote, observed. Then I crossed that out too, because neither word was right. It wasn't the feeling of being looked at. It was the feeling of being relevant to something. Of being part of a process I didn't understand. I stopped going after a few weeks. Not because anything happened. Because nothing happened, and I was starting to worry about what I was becoming, the kind of person who sits alone in dark hallways at midnight trying to feel something that might not be there. February. I hadn't forgotten about March. I'd spent the winter researching emergency lighting systems, reading technical manuals, forums, case studies. I was looking for any documented case of a full building emergency lighting activation without power loss, with no detectable fault, recurring annually. I didn't find one. Plenty of single-unit malfunctions. Plenty of false activations caused by faulty sensors or degraded wiring. But nothing like what Building C did. Every unit, every floor, all at once, same month, every year, for decades. I decided to do something different. Instead of trying to catch the lights in the act and diagnose the fault, I was going to document the activation in detail. I borrowed 3 cameras from the college's AV department, small, cheap units used for recording lectures, and set them up in Building C in late February. One on each floor, pointed down the main corridor with clear sight lines to multiple emergency light units. I also placed a data logger on the main electrical panel that would record voltage, current, and frequency every second. Dale saw me carrying the equipment and asked what I was doing. I told him. He looked at me for a moment and said, "Okay." Then he went back to whatever he was working on. I'm not sure what I expected from him. Permission, maybe. Or a warning. Instead, I got the same flat acceptance he applied to everything. The thermostat in D reads 8 degrees high every Tuesday. The emergency lights in C come on every March. Dale press exhorts conduit fittings. March 4th. I was at home eating dinner. Leftover chili. Which I mention only because I remember the specific mundane details of that evening very clearly when my phone buzzed. Marcus from security. The lights were on. I drove to campus. It was raining lightly, the kind of cold rain that can't decide if it wants to be sleet. The parking lot was empty except for Marcus's car and the security golf cart under its canopy. Building C was glowing from within, that same pale emergency light washing the windows. I went inside, same as before. Every emergency light on every floor. Regular power functioning normally. No fault on the panel. But this time I had the cameras running. I didn't reset the system immediately. Instead, I walked through the building slowly, floor by floor, checking each unit. They were all on, all functioning exactly as they would during a genuine power failure. The exit signs were lit green. The battery packs were discharging, powering the lights, even though they had no reason to. The transfer switch hadn't been triggered. The panel showed no interruption. I spent 40 minutes in the building. I checked every junction box on every floor. I checked the utility connections where the main feed entered the building from the underground conduit. I checked the grounding. Everything was normal. Everything except the fact that every emergency light in the building was on. I stood in the 3rd floor hallway outside room 312 and the lights were on and the hallway was cold and I could smell that metallic smell stronger than I'd ever noticed it. And I had the thought, not a rational thought, not a theory, just a feeling that rose up from somewhere below logic, that the building was showing me something, that the lights were not a malfunction. They were a demonstration, an indication. Like when you press the test button on a smoke detector, not because there's smoke, but because you want someone to know the system is still active. I stood there and the lights hummed faintly and the rain tapped against the windows and I thought, what system? Then I went downstairs and reset the panel and the lights went off and I drove home. The cameras had recorded everything, which turned out to be nothing. 3 angles of empty hallways with the emergency lights on. The footage showed exactly what I'd seen with my own eyes. The lights came on simultaneously, all at once. Not a cascade, not one floor and then the next, but every unit in the building activating at the same instant. The data logger confirmed what the panel had shown. No voltage drop, no frequency deviation, no interruption of any kind on the main power feed. The system had activated without being triggered. I showed the data to Dale. He looked at the graphs, the timestamps, the footage. He nodded. Same as always, he said. Dale, this shouldn't be possible. The transfer switch wasn't engaged, the relay didn't trip, but the lights came on. All of them. How does that happen? I don't know. Doesn't that bother you? He set the printout down on his desk, next to the coffee mug he'd been using for so long that the inside was stained a permanent brown. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something behind his patience. Not fear, something more like resignation. When I first started here, he said, I spent 2 years trying to figure it out. Brought in electricians, called the manufacturer, Even had a guy from the state fire marshal's office come look at it. Nobody could explain it. Nobody could make it stop. He paused. At some point, you either accept that some things don't have explanations, or you let it eat you alive. Jenkins let it eat him alive. Jenkins, your predecessor. He got fixated on it. Started spending nights in the building. Started keeping notebooks. Dale looked at me steadily. Notebooks full of temperature readings and smell observations and feelings about the third floor. I didn't say anything. He took early retirement at 53. I heard he moved to Arizona, somewhere flat and dry with no old buildings. The conversation was over. Dale went back to his fittings. I went back to Building C and retrieved my cameras and data logger and put them back where they belonged. But I didn't throw away my notebook. I should have let it go. Dale was right. Some things don't have explanations, and the healthy response is to accept that and move on. I'd spent 20 years in facilities maintenance. I knew how old buildings worked. I knew about thermal drift, electrical gremlins, phantom loads, all the little mysteries that buildings accumulate over decades. This was just another one. More dramatic than most, maybe. More persistent. But not fundamentally different from the thermostat in D or the sump pump in A. Except I didn't believe that. And I don't think Dale believed it either, despite what he said. Because there was a difference between a thermostat reading 8 degrees high and an entire emergency lighting system activating simultaneously without a trigger. One was a quirk. The other was... I didn't have a word for what the other was. I started looking into the history of the building more carefully. Not the electrical system this time. The building itself. What it had been used for. Who had worked there? What had happened inside its walls over the past 50-plus years. Most of what I found was unremarkable. Classrooms. Offices. Faculty meetings. The English department had been there since the building opened. The history department had occupied the second floor until 2001, when they moved to Building A after a renovation. A small psychology lab had operated on the ground floor in the 80s before the science programs consolidated in Building D. But I kept coming back to two things. The third floor and the month of March. Dr. Priya Chandran, English Department, room 312. Left in 2003 without explanation. I tried to find her. This time I searched more carefully. Academic databases, faculty listings at other colleges, professional organizations. I found a conference paper she'd published in 1996 about narrative theory. I found a citation in someone else's dissertation from 2001. After 2003, nothing. No publications, no teaching positions, no conference appearances. She'd left Hargrove and, as far as the academic record was concerned, vanished. I found one more thing. In the campus police log, which the college kept in paper form in a filing cabinet in the security office, accessible to facilities staff because we sometimes needed to cross-reference incident reports with damage reports, there was an entry from March 11, 2003. Responded to Building C, third floor, report of emergency lighting activation. Upon arrival, lights were on throughout building. Checked all floors, building empty and secured. Maintenance notified. Nut. Strong odor reported on third floor, metallic in nature. Source not identified. March 2003. The same year, Dr. Chandran disappeared from the college directory. I am aware, I need to keep saying this, that I am drawing connections that may not exist. A professor leaving a job and an emergency light malfunction are not inherently related events. People leave jobs for 1,000 reasons. Electrical systems malfunction. These facts can coexist without being connected. But the smell. The campus police officer in 2003 had described the same metallic smell I'd been tracking. The same smell that Gary Metzger might have noticed in 1997. The same smell that was always strongest on the third floor, near room 312, near the office that had once belonged to a woman who left and never surfaced again. I went to room 312 on a Saturday afternoon in April. The room was a classroom now. Had been since 2004, according to the room assignment records. Standard setup. Rows of tablet armchairs, a whiteboard, a projector mounted to the ceiling, a teacher's desk in the front corner. Nothing remarkable. I stood in the room and tried to imagine it as an office. The dimensions were wrong. The room was too large for a single office. I checked the blueprints again. In the original 1970 plans, the space that was now room 312 had been divided into two smaller rooms, 312 and 312A. A wall had been removed at some point to create the larger classroom. I looked at the floor. Under the institutional carpet tiles, the kind that come in 2-foot squares and pull up easily for access to the floor beneath, I could see the outline of the old wall, a line in the concrete where the framing had been anchored. It ran roughly through the middle of the room, dividing it into two unequal spaces. I pulled up a few carpet tiles along the line. The concrete beneath was stained. Not dramatically. Not in a way you'd notice unless you were looking. But there was a discoloration in the concrete, roughly along the line of the old wall, that was darker than the surrounding floor. It could have been water damage. Could have been adhesive residue from the old carpet. Could have been anything. I put the tiles back. I stood up. The room was quiet and bright with afternoon sun coming through the windows, and I could smell nothing, feel nothing. It was just a room. I left. I keep wanting to tell you that something definitive happened. That I found a document, or a body, or a message scratched into a wall. Something that would make this story resolve. But that's not what happened. What happened was subtler and, I think, worse. What happened was March. The next March. My second March, at Hargrove. March 7th. The lights came on. Same as before. Same as always. Marcus called me. I drove to campus. But this time, when I entered Building C and walked through the ground floor hallway under the glow of the emergency lights, I heard something. Not a dramatic sound, not a scream or a bang or a whisper. A hum, low, almost subsonic, felt more than heard. Coming from everywhere and nowhere. Coming from the walls, maybe, or the floor, or the light fixtures themselves. I stopped walking and stood still and listened. The hum was constant. Steady. Not mechanical. It didn't have the rhythm of a motor or a compressor. It was more like a tone. A sustained note at the very bottom edge of hearing. I walked up to the second floor. The hum was there too. Same pitch, same volume. Third floor. Same. It filled the building evenly, like temperature. I went back to the mechanical room and checked every piece of equipment. Boiler, pumps, air handlers, electrical panel. Nothing was producing the sound. I turned off the boiler. The hum continued. I turned off the air handlers. The hum continued. I killed the main breaker for the regular lighting circuits. The emergency lights stayed on because they were running on battery. The hum continued. I stood in the mechanical room with everything I could shut down, in a building powered only by emergency battery packs, and the hum was still there. Still constant. Still that same low, sustained tone that I could feel in my sternum. I stayed in the building for 2 hours that night. I walked every hallway, every stairwell, every classroom. I checked the utility tunnel access in the basement. I went up on the roof. The hum was everywhere inside the building and nowhere outside it. The moment I stepped through an exterior door, it stopped. The moment I stepped back in, it resumed. At 11:47 p.m., the emergency lights went off on their own. Not because I reset them. I hadn't touched the panel. They just went off all at once, the same way they'd come on. And the hum stopped at the same instant. I stood in the dark hallway on the third floor. Just me and the green glow of the exit signs. I could still feel the hum in my chest, the way you can still feel the vibration of a car engine after you've turned it off and gotten out. I wrote in my notebook, hum, everywhere. Stopped when lights stopped. 11:47 p.m., I added. Building was running on batteries. Nothing else was on. The hum was not produced by any equipment I can identify. Then I added one more line which I almost didn't write because it was not an observation but an interpretation, and I'd been trying so hard to keep those separate. The building was not malfunctioning. The building was doing something.